She had nothing but her body to offer, and the cowboy still let the frozen Apache woman in. The world was quiet except for the crunch of snow beneath hidden rocks and the occasional groan of a distant tree bending under the weight of ice. In this vast, frozen wilderness, life was a constant struggle, and only those with courage, skill, or sheer stubbornness could survive. The cowboy trudged through the snow, his worn boots heavy with ice and frost. He had been out since dawn, checking his traps and making sure the small herd of cattle he had managed to raise were still alive. Life was hard and the land was unforgiving, but the cowboy had grown used to it. Years of living alone had taught him how to read the sky, how to hear the faintest movements in the snow, and how to survive when nature seemed determined to crush anyone who dared challenge it. His cabin stood a mile back, a small wooden structure with smoke curling from the chimney. It offered warmth, safety, and a small sense of peace that the wilderness rarely allowed. But even in the safety of his home, the cold could never truly be escaped. He had learned to prepare for it, stacking firewood, sealing cracks in the cabin walls, and keeping his animals close. The land demanded vigilance, and any lapse could be deadly. As he moved along the ridge, scanning the frozen plains for signs of life, he noticed something unusual. At first, he thought it was a trick of the wind, a shadow that moved oddly across the snow. But as he squinted, he saw the unmistakable shape of a person huddled low, crawling painfully through the snow. The figure was small, frail, and swathed in tattered clothing that had clearly done little to protect against the harsh winter. The cowboy slowed, careful not to startle the stranger. He had seen travelers and wanderers before, some lost, some desperate, and some foolish enough to think they could cross this wilderness unprepared. But something about this figure made him pause. The person's movements were weak, unsteady, and it was clear that without help they would not last long in the cold. He called out softly, his voice rough but steady. "Hey there, you need help." The figure looked up, revealing the pale, frozen face of a woman. Her eyes, wide and frightened, met his. The skin on her cheeks was raw and red from the wind, and her lips were cracked and trembling. She tried to speak, but only a weak whisper emerged, almost lost to the wind. Her body shook violently with cold and she could not rise. The cowboy's heart tightened at the sight. He knew he had to act quickly. Without thinking twice, he set down the small pack he carried and approached her cautiously. "Come on, you can't stay out here," he said, kneeling beside her. The snow was deep, and moving her would be difficult, but it was the only chance she had. With effort, he helped her to her feet. Her body was so weak that she almost fell immediately, leaning heavily on him. He wrapped his thick coat around her shoulders, trying to offer some warmth. Even his sturdy gloves felt inadequate against the sharp bite of the cold that had claimed her so thoroughly. Step by step, he guided her toward the cabin, supporting her under her arms. The journey was slow and exhausting. Each step sank into the deep snow, and the wind tried to push them backward, testing their endurance. The woman's small frame shook with exhaustion and fear, but the cowboy did not let go. He kept his focus on the cabin ahead, the only place where warmth could reach her, the only place where survival was possible. Finally, after what felt like hours, they reached the cabin. The cowboy quickly opened the door and ushered her inside. Warm air, thick with the scent of burning wood and earth, greeted them. The woman gasped as the heat hit her frozen skin. She collapsed onto the wooden floor, shivering violently, and the cowboy helped her to the chair by the fire. He quickly pulled a blanket from the cabin's small collection and wrapped her tightly. The woman's lips moved again, forming words too weak to hear. The cowboy knelt beside her, pressing his gloved hand gently to her shoulder. "It's all right. You're safe now," he said. "Just rest. You've been through a lot." Her teeth chattered uncontrollably, and her eyes darted around the cabin, as if she were still unsure if this sanctuary was real. The cowboy understood her fear. He had spent many years in solitude and knew the wilderness could make people suspicious, even fearful of kindness. He did not rush her. He simply kept the fire burning and waited. Hours passed. The woman slowly began to recover, her shivering lessening as her body absorbed the warmth of the cabin and the fire. She drank small sips of water, and the cowboy handed her a piece of bread he had saved from his provisions. He did not speak much, knowing that words were not always necessary. Sometimes, simply offering safety and steady presence was enough to convey care. As she regained strength, the cowboy observed her more closely. Her clothes, worn and thin, told a story of long travel and hardship. Her hands were calloused, her fingers stiff from the cold, and her face bore the marks of exposure and struggle. But despite the hardships, there was a quiet resilience about her, a strength that could not be hidden, even in such desperate circumstances. The cowboy admired this resilience silently. He had met many people in his life, some brash, some cunning, some careless. But this woman's courage, the simple act of surviving alone in the wilderness, impressed him. He knew that trust had to be earned, and though she had no choice but to accept his help now, he also understood that she was not weak in spirit. Night fell and the wind outside howled even louder. The woman curled into the blanket, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. The cowboy stoked the fire and watched over her, ensuring she remained safe. Loneliness had been his companion for many years, but tonight it was replaced with a sense of responsibility. He had saved her from the cold, and now it was his duty to see her through the night. Sleep came slowly, interrupted by the occasional gust of wind rattling the cabin walls. But as the hours passed, the woman's breathing became steadier and her small frame relaxed. The cowboy allowed himself a moment of relief. The wilderness was harsh, but sometimes, even in the coldest, most unforgiving places, acts of kindness could make a difference. By morning, the woman stirred, blinking against the light streaming through the cabin window. She looked around, confused at first, and then relief washed over her face. The cowboy offered a small smile. "You made it through the night," he said. "That's the hardest part." She nodded, her lips quivering, but she managed a faint smile in return. Words were still difficult, but her gratitude was clear. The cowboy understood without needing to hear them. He had seen many things in his life, but there was a special satisfaction in knowing he had helped someone survive against all odds. The first day of recovery had passed. There would be more challenges ahead: food, shelter, and learning to trust each other. But for now, they had overcome the immediate danger. The cowboy felt a quiet pride in his decision to help, and the woman felt the first warmth of hope since she had been lost in the snow. Outside, the wind continued to whip across the plains, indifferent to human struggle. But inside the cabin, a small fire burned, and two lives, strangers only hours ago, were connected by survival, trust, and the fragile warmth of human kindness. And so, in the middle of a harsh, frozen world, the cowboy and the Apache woman began the first chapter of a story neither could have imagined, one where hope was fragile but real, and where simple acts of compassion could turn the coldest night into a new beginning. The morning. Light spilled through the small window of the cabin, cutting through the smoke and warm air inside. The fire still glowed, casting dancing shadows across the walls, and the cowboy moved quietly to stoke it, careful not to disturb the woman who slept in the corner wrapped in a thick blanket. The night had been long and harsh, but she had survived. That in itself was a small victory in the unforgiving wilderness. When she finally stirred, blinking against the light, the cowboy offered a gentle nod. "Good morning," he said in his low, steady voice. "You slept well." The woman's lips trembled and she gave a faint nod. Words were slow to come, and even when she tried, her voice was little more than a whisper. She pointed weakly to the fire and then to her own body, and the cowboy understood immediately. She was still cold, still weak, and needed more warmth before she could think about moving or eating properly. He brought over another blanket, draping it around her shoulders, and poured some water into a small cup. "Drink slowly," he instructed. She obeyed, her hands shaking as she held the cup. The water warmed her from the inside, a small comfort that made her shiver less violently. Breakfast was simple: a few hard biscuits, some dried meat, and a bit of hot water mixed with powdered milk. The woman ate cautiously, unsure of her strength, but the cowboy encouraged her quietly, never rushing, letting her regain her energy at her own pace. As she ate, she finally managed to speak, her voice thin but clear enough to understand. Thank you," she said, her accent soft, unfamiliar, yet earnest. The cowboy nodded, acknowledging her gratitude without making a big fuss. He had helped others before, and while kindness was not always easy in the wilderness, he knew it could save lives. After breakfast, he showed her the cabin, explaining where things were: the small stove, the firewood pile, the supplies he had carefully stored for the winter. She listened attentively, her eyes wide, taking in every detail. Despite the exhaustion and cold, there was a spark in her gaze, a determination to survive and to understand this strange, isolated place. "You'll need to move carefully," the cowboy advised. "The snow outside is deep and it's easy to slip. Take it slow." She nodded again, trying to stand, but her legs wobbled beneath her. The cowboy quickly stepped forward, steadying her with a firm hand on her back. "Not too fast," he said. "One step at a time." Outside, the world was a frozen expanse, white and endless, stretching to the horizon. The sun glinted off the snow, making the landscape almost blinding in its brightness. The woman had never seen anything like it. She had traveled through mountains, deserts, and forests, but this stark, frozen wilderness was both beautiful and terrifying. The cowboy led her to a small outdoor pen where a few of his cattle huddled together for warmth. "They're hungry," he said, gesturing to the piles of hay he had stacked. "Help me feed them if you can." At first she was hesitant, unsure how to handle the animals. Her hands were stiff from the cold, and the smell of the cattle made her uneasy. But under the cowboy's patient guidance, she slowly learned to move the hay, coax the animals to eat, and even pat a cow gently on the head. The work was hard and she struggled, but she also smiled faintly, a sign of small victories that gave her hope. After feeding the cattle, they returned to the cabin. The cowboy set to work repairing a small section of the roof where snow had crept through the cracks, while she gathered kindling and helped stoke the fire. The day passed slowly but productively. There were moments of silence, broken only by the crackle of the fire or the occasional gust of wind outside, but there were also small conversations. She told him her name, Akla, and he offered his own, Tom. The words felt strange on her tongue at first, and she repeated them slowly, testing the sounds, but each repetition seemed to give her more confidence. Tom listened, asking gentle questions, not prying too deeply but showing interest in her story. Akla's story was fragmented at first. She had been traveling alone after losing her family to illness and hardship. She spoke of long journeys through forests and across rivers, of nights spent under the stars, and of the constant fear of danger from both the elements and people who might not have been kind. Tom listened quietly, nodding occasionally, understanding the weight of her words. He had faced similar hardships, though his battles were often against the wilderness itself rather than people, and he recognized the courage it took to survive so long alone. By afternoon, Akla's strength had grown. She was still weak, but the fire, food, and steady presence of Tom gave her energy. They ventured briefly outside to gather more firewood. The wind bit at their faces, but together they worked, stacking the wood carefully to ensure the cabin would remain warm through the coming night. During these small tasks, trust began to form. Tom noticed her resilience, the way she handled difficulties without complaint, even when the cold cut through her thin clothing. Akla noticed his careful, deliberate actions and the way he treated the animals and the land with respect. Both understood in quiet ways that survival here required more than strength. It required patience, intelligence, and cooperation. As the sun began to set, painting the snow in shades of gold and orange, they returned to the cabin. The fire was already warm, and Tom had prepared a small meal of soup and bread. Akla ate eagerly but carefully, savoring the warmth and nourishment. She looked around the cabin, her eyes resting on the simple tools and supplies that made life possible in such a harsh place. She realized that, for the first time in weeks, perhaps months, she felt safe. That night, Tom offered her a place near the fire to sleep, closer than before. She hesitated for a moment, aware of the unfamiliarity of such closeness, but the exhaustion in her body outweighed any fear. Curling into the blankets, she felt the warmth seep into her chilled bones. "Rest well," Tom said softly. "Tomorrow will be another long day." Akla nodded, her eyes heavy, and she drifted into sleep quickly, the fire's warmth and the cabin's shelter providing comfort she had not known in a long time. Tom watched her for a moment, then returned to tending the fire, ensuring that it burned steadily throughout the night. He thought about the strange turn his life had taken, so used to solitude, now sharing his cabin with a person whose life had intersected with his in the harshest possible circumstances. As he stared into the fire, he reflected on the unspoken bond forming between them. Survival had forced them together, but respect, understanding, and cautious trust were beginning to grow naturally. Akla was no longer just a stranger. She was a fellow traveler, someone who had endured hardships similar to his own, and someone who could teach him lessons about resilience and courage that he had forgotten over years of solitude. Outside, the cold wind continued to whip through the snow-covered plains, indifferent to the lives it threatened. Inside the cabin, however, warmth and hope lingered. They had survived the first full day together, and each small victory, food eaten, fire stoked, trust slowly built, was a triumph in the face of a world that often seemed determined to crush the weak. As the night deepened, both Tom and Akla felt a quiet peace, a sense of being alive and connected. The wilderness could be merciless, but human kindness, even in its simplest forms, had power. Shelter, warmth, patience, and respect, these were as vital as any weapon against the cold. And in sharing them, they were beginning to build something more enduring than mere survival, a fragile, growing trust, the foundation of a bond that would help both of them endure the harsh days ahead. Though neither spoke further that night, the silence was comfortable. The fire crackled, the wind howled, and outside, the vast frozen plain stretched endlessly, but inside the small cabin, life persisted. They had faced danger and survived, and together they would face whatever challenges the coming days might bring. The next morning arrived with a pale sun rising slowly over the snow-covered plains. The wind was still sharp, but the sky was clear and the light gave the cabin a warm glow. Akla stirred first, stretching her stiff limbs and shivering slightly despite the blankets. The warmth of the fire had helped her recover, but the cold outside had left its mark. She looked around at the cabin, at the small comforts Tom had built over years of living alone. A sturdy stove, neatly stacked firewood, simple furniture, and a few small tools for survival. It was not much, but it was everything to someone trying to survive in the wilderness. Tom was already up, feeding the cattle in the pen outside. He noticed her at the door and waved her over. "Come on," he said, his voice low but friendly. "We need to check the animals. They'll get restless if we don't feed them." Akla moved carefully, still weak but determined. She had learned the basics yesterday, and her confidence had grown a little. Together, they approached the pen. The cows shifted their weight, noses sniffing at the cold air. Akla helped Tom place hay in the feeding troughs, following his instructions as best she could. Though her movements were slow and tentative at first, she gradually gained confidence, and Tom noticed the small smile she gave when a cow ate from her hand. After feeding the animals, they returned to the cabin. Tom decided it was time to teach her a few more survival skills. He handed her a small axe and demonstrated how to carefully chop firewood. "You have to watch your hands," he warned. "One slip and you could get hurt. Safety first always." Akla watched him intently, studying the rhythm of his movements. She picked up the axe and tried to imitate him, her small arms trembling with effort. The first few swings were awkward, but soon she began to find a rhythm. Each piece of wood she chopped felt like a victory, proof that she was regaining strength and learning to survive in a harsh, unfamiliar world. Tom watched her carefully, correcting her gently when needed, but letting her take pride in each small success. As they worked, the conversation between them grew easier. Akla told Tom more about her past, not all at once but in fragments. She spoke of the land she had traveled through, the rivers she had crossed, and the forests she had wandered. She described her family, long lost to illness and hardship, and the loneliness she had felt during her long journey. Tom listened quietly, offering small words of comfort but never pushing her to speak more than she wanted. In return, Tom shared stories of his own life. He spoke of the cattle he raised, the winters he had survived, and the lessons he had learned living alone in such a harsh place. Akla listened, fascinated by the quiet courage it took to live in isolation. Despite their differences, she began to feel a connection, a recognition that both had faced hardships and had survived through determination and resilience. By midday, the sun was high and the air had warmed slightly. Tom decided it was time to check the perimeter of the cabin. Wolves and other wild animals sometimes roamed the area, and the cabin, though sturdy, was not completely safe from predators. He handed Akla a small knife for protection and explained the importance of staying aware. They walked carefully through the snow, testing the ground for hidden dangers. The plains stretched endlessly, white and blinding under the sun. The wind had calmed, but the cold was still present, biting at their cheeks and fingers. Tom showed Akla how to read the tracks in the snow, pointing out the signs of animals nearby. She listened intently, learning to distinguish between the tracks of rabbits, deer, and wolves. As they worked, Akla began to feel a sense of accomplishment. She realized she was no longer entirely helpless. The skills she was learning from Tom gave her confidence, and the steady rhythm of work and small victories helped her regain not only physical strength but also hope. When they returned to the cabin, they took a moment to rest. The fire was already burning, filling the small room with warmth. Tom handed Akla a cup of hot water and a piece of bread. She ate slowly, savoring the warmth and nourishment. "Thank you," she said quietly, her eyes meeting his. I feel stronger today." Tom nodded, a faint smile on his face. "Good," he said. "Strength comes in small steps. Each day you'll get stronger if you keep learning and paying attention." The afternoon passed with more lessons. Tom taught Akla how to set simple traps for small animals, how to identify edible plants, and how to prepare firewood efficiently. Each task was carefully explained, and Akla practiced under his watchful eye. Mistakes were made, but each mistake became a lesson. By evening, she could perform simple tasks on her own, and Tom began to see the beginnings of real confidence in her movements. As the sky darkened and snow clouds began to gather on the horizon, they returned to the cabin. Inside, the warmth of the fire welcomed them. Tom prepared a small meal of soup and bread, and Akla ate hungrily, the day's work leaving her exhausted but satisfied. They spoke little, content in the silence and the quiet companionship that had grown between them. Later, as they sat by the fire, Akla asked a question that had been on her mind for a while. "Why did you help me?" she asked softly, her voice trembling slightly. Tom looked into the fire, thinking carefully before answering. "Because it was the right thing to do," he said finally. "Out here it's easy to look the other way, but everyone deserves a chance to survive. You were in danger, you needed help. I couldn't just leave you out there." Akla considered his words, feeling a mix of gratitude and disbelief. In her travels, she had often met people who were unkind or indifferent. To meet someone willing to risk his own comfort, and perhaps safety for her, was almost unbelievable. Slowly, she realized that kindness could exist, even in the harshest conditions. Night fell fully, and the wind outside picked up again, whistling against the cabin walls. Tom made sure the fire burned steadily and that Akela was wrapped in blankets before he sat down himself. They spoke in whispers for a while, sharing thoughts about the day, but eventually exhaustion took over. Akela curled up near the fire, feeling warmth seep into her chilled bones. The fear and loneliness she had carried for so long began to ease, replaced by a fragile sense of safety and belonging. She realized that, for the first time in weeks, perhaps months, she felt connected to another human being in a meaningful way. Tom, too, reflected on the day. He had spent years in solitude, often feeling isolated but content with his independence. Yet now, with Akela learning to survive and grow stronger, he felt a sense of purpose he had not experienced before. Her progress, her determination, and the small bond forming between them brought a quiet satisfaction he had not known was missing from his life. Outside, the snow continued to fall lightly, dusting the plains in a thin, delicate layer. The world remained cold and unforgiving, but inside the cabin, warmth and hope thrived. The partnership between Tom and Akela was still new and fragile, but it was growing, strengthened by trust, patience, and the shared goal of survival. As they drifted to sleep, both knew that challenges lay ahead. The wilderness was never forgiving, and each day would bring new tests of strength, skill, and courage. But for the first time, neither of them faced these challenges alone. Together they had survived another day, and with each passing moment, the bond between them deepened. A bond built not just on necessity, but on respect, understanding, and the quiet power of human kindness. Tomorrow they would face the cold plains again. There would be more lessons, more obstacles, and more opportunities to grow stronger. But tonight, as the fire burned low and the wind howled outside, they rested, safe and united by the fragile yet undeniable thread of trust that had begun to form between them. And in the quiet of the small cabin surrounded by the harsh, frozen world outside, Akela and Tom took comfort in a simple truth. Even in the coldest and most unforgiving places, hope could exist and kindness could endure. The following morning arrived gray and heavy, with clouds hanging low over the frozen plains. The wind had grown stronger overnight, rattling the cabin and tossing snow across the landscape. Tom and Akela awoke to the sound of the storm building outside, its icy fingers creeping closer with each gust. Despite the cold and the threat of the weather, both were determined to make the most of the day. Breakfast was quick, a small portion of bread and hot water mixed with a bit of milk. They ate silently, feeling the warmth of the fire seep into their bodies. The storm made movement outside difficult, but Tom knew they had to make preparations. The snow could trap animals, block paths, and make even the shortest journey dangerous. He had learned long ago that survival depended on foresight and careful planning. "Today we'll reinforce the cabin," Tom said, his voice calm but firm. "The wind is strong. Snow will pile up against the walls and we can't have it breaking through." Akela nodded, bundling herself in extra layers and grabbing the tools Tom had set aside. The day would be long and exhausting, but it was necessary. Together, they worked to secure the roof, pile extra logs around the foundation, and block gaps where the wind might sneak in. The work was hard, especially in the growing storm, but they moved steadily, supporting each other when one faltered. As they worked, Tom noticed a shift in Akela. She moved with more confidence now, swinging the hammer and carrying heavy logs without as much hesitation. He saw the determination in her eyes and the pride in her small smile when a task was completed. Her strength had grown since the day he found her, and her resilience impressed him. She had faced danger alone before, and now, even under his guidance, she was becoming capable of handling challenges on her own. By midday, the wind was howling, and the snow swirled in blinding drifts around the cabin. They paused for a brief rest, huddled near the fire inside. Akla sipped warm water, her hands wrapped around the cup for warmth, while Tom checked the animals in the pen. The cows were restless, their breath visible in the cold air, and Tom realized that the storm might last for several days. Food for the animals could run low and they would need to ration carefully. "Looks like we'll be stuck here for a while," he said quietly. "The snow isn't letting up." Akla nodded, her gaze distant. She had faced isolation before, but now she understood what it meant to rely on someone else in these conditions. She realized that survival was not just about skill, it was about trust and about knowing when to accept help. She looked at Tom with quiet gratitude, appreciating his steady presence in this dangerous world. As the afternoon progressed, a sound outside caught their attention, a low, distant growl, faint at first but growing steadily louder. Tom froze, his instincts sharp. Wolves often roamed the plains, especially during storms when hunting was more difficult. He had seen them before, and he knew the danger they could pose to both people and animals. Akla noticed his sudden tension. What is it?" she asked softly. "Wolves," Tom replied, keeping his voice calm. "They're close. We need to make sure the animals are safe, and we have to be ready ourselves." They moved quickly but cautiously. Tom guided Akla to stand behind him as he checked the pen, making sure the cows were secure. The wolves' howls grew louder, echoing across the snow-covered plains. It was a tense and frightening sound, but Tom remained composed, showing Akla that fear could be managed with careful action. "Stay behind me," he instructed. "They usually don't come close if they see we're prepared, but we can't take chances." Akla nodded, gripping the small knife he had given her tightly. Her hands were cold, but she did not tremble. She understood now that survival required courage and focus. Together, they worked to reinforce the pen and stack extra firewood around the cabin, creating a small barrier between themselves and the hungry wolves outside. Hours passed. The storm raged, and the wolves' howls continued, a reminder of the wild dangers surrounding them. Tom and Akla worked in tandem, each task building trust and reinforcing their partnership. He showed her how to make noise to scare the wolves away, how to move quietly yet quickly, and how to observe the environment for signs of danger. Akla absorbed every lesson, her confidence growing with each successful action. By evening, the storm had not yet passed, but the immediate danger had lessened. The wolves had moved on, likely finding easier prey elsewhere, and the cabin and animals were secure. Both were exhausted but relieved. Akla sank into a chair near the fire, shivering as warmth returned to her body, while Tom stoked the flames to ensure they would last through the night. They ate a small meal in silence, the events of the day weighing on them. Akla finally broke the quiet. I was scared," she admitted softly, her voice trembling slightly. "I thought I might not survive out there." Tom looked at her calmly. "Fear is natural," he said. "It keeps you alert. What matters is what you do with it. You faced it and you did what was necessary. That's courage." Akla considered his words, feeling a mix of relief and pride. She realized that survival was not just about enduring the cold or finding food. It was about mental strength, about learning to trust oneself and others. Tom had shown her that even in the harshest conditions, people could rely on one another. The night was long, with the storm continuing to batter the cabin, but inside the fire burned steadily, and a quiet companionship grew between them. Akla reflected on how far she had come in just a few days, from a frightened, weakened traveler to someone capable of facing challenges alongside another person. Tom, too, reflected on the lessons he had learned from her resilience and determination. He realized that even in years of solitude, there were new things to understand about courage, trust, and human connection. As the hours passed, the storm began to ease slightly. The wind still howled, but the snow fell more gently, covering the plains in a smooth, white blanket. Tom and Akla sat by the fire, exhausted but alert, sharing quiet conversation about the day and the challenges they had faced. Each word, each glance reinforced their growing bond. By the time sleep came, it was deep and restful. Both had survived another day of hardship, and they had done it together. The external danger, the wolves, the storm, had tested their courage, their skills, and their trust in one another. And in facing it, they had discovered that cooperation, patience, and careful planning were as vital as strength or skill in the wilderness. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, perhaps more storms, perhaps more dangers from the wild, but they were no longer alone in facing them. Akla had learned to rely on Tom, and Tom had learned to appreciate the quiet courage she carried. Together, they had proven that survival was not just about enduring the elements. It was about partnership, respect, and the courage to face the unknown together. As the night deepened, the fire crackled and popped, sending warm light across the cabin. Outside, the snow lay heavy, but inside, the bond between Tom and Akla grew stronger with every shared task, every lesson, and every quiet moment of understanding. In the midst of the harsh and unforgiving wilderness, hope endured, strengthened by the human spirit and the growing trust between two people who had found each other in the cold. And so, as the wind whistled through the plains and the wolves roamed far beyond, the cabin remained a small sanctuary, a place of warmth, learning, and the fragile, yet powerful, beginnings of friendship and trust. The following morning arrived brighter than it had in weeks. The storm had passed, leaving the plains glistening under the pale sunlight, each snowflake sparkling like tiny crystals. The wind had calmed, and the cold, though still sharp, was no longer oppressive. Tom stepped outside the cabin, taking a deep breath of the crisp winter air. For the first time in days, the world felt calm. Akla joined him, wrapping herself in the thick blanket she had grown accustomed to, but carrying herself with more confidence than the first day he had found her. She had regained strength, both in body and spirit, and the harsh lessons of survival had made her resilient. Together, they surveyed the frozen plains, noting the tracks of animals that had ventured closer to the cabin during the storm. The world was quiet but alive, and the promise of spring was faintly in the air. Tom and Akla spent the morning tending to the cabin and the animals. The storm had left some damage. A section of the roof had weakened, and the snow had piled high around the fence, threatening to collapse it under its weight. Working side by side, they repaired the damage, stacking wood carefully and reinforcing weak spots. Akla moved with ease now, her arms strong and steady, and Tom could see how much she had learned in a short time. She was no longer the frightened, shivering traveler who had stumbled into his life days ago. After securing the cabin, Tom decided it was time to prepare a proper meal. He had some preserved vegetables and meat, and he worked with Akla to cook over the fire. The process was slow, but it was a shared effort that brought a sense of accomplishment and normalcy. As the smell of cooking food filled the cabin, Akla smiled genuinely, savoring the simple pleasure of warmth, nourishment, and companionship. During the meal, they spoke more freely than ever before. Akla told Tom stories of her childhood, of her family, and of the land she had known before the hardships began. She spoke of rivers that glittered like silver, forests that seemed to stretch forever, and nights spent under a sky full of stars. Tom listened intently, fascinated by her stories, and he shared his own memories of the plains, the cattle he raised, and the solitude he had endured. The two found common ground in their experiences of struggle and survival, and a deep respect had formed between them. After the meal, they decided to venture outside. The snow, though still present, was lighter, and the path to the nearby hills was clearer. They walked together, testing their strength and stamina, practicing the skills Tom had taught her. Akla carried firewood, balanced awkwardly at first but with growing ease. Tom showed her how to navigate the snow-covered terrain, how to notice changes in the wind, and how to spot tracks in the snow. She absorbed every lesson, her confidence growing with each step. As they climbed a small rise, they paused to look at the world around them. The frozen plains stretched endlessly, a stark white expanse, but in the distance, hints of green could be seen where the snow had begun to melt. A river ran quietly, its edges frozen but moving, and birds chirped faintly, a reminder that life persisted even in the harshest conditions. Akla took a deep breath, feeling a sense of peace she had not known for weeks. Tom watched her quietly, impressed by how far she had come. She had endured the cold, the storm, and the dangers of the wild, and yet she had grown stronger, wiser, and more self-reliant. He realized that their partnership had not only ensured survival, but had also forged a bond built on trust, respect, and shared experience. They had learned to rely on each other, and in doing so, they had discovered the strength within themselves. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the snow in shades of pink and gold, they returned to the cabin. The fire was already glowing, and the warmth welcomed them. They ate together in silence at first, but the comfort of shared accomplishment allowed for easy conversation. Akla laughed softly at a small story Tom shared, a sound that was almost foreign to the cabin but beautiful in its simplicity. After dinner, they tended to the animals one last time before nightfall. The storm had passed, the worst of the winter was behind them, and the land was beginning to show signs of life. Tom looked at Akla, realizing that she was no longer dependent solely on him. She had learned, grown, and adapted. The survival that had once been a desperate struggle had become a shared effort, and the trust between them had solidified. Night fell, and the cabin felt warmer than ever. The wind outside had quieted, and the air was filled with the subtle sounds of the recovering wilderness. They sat near the fire, side by side, reflecting on the days that had passed. Akla's eyes shone with quiet pride, and Tom felt a sense of fulfillment he had not known for years. They had faced the storm, the wolves, and the harsh cold together, and they had emerged stronger and more capable. "Tomorrow," Tom said softly, "we can start preparing for the spring. The snow will melt, and we'll need to tend the land and the animals." Akla nodded, her face serious but hopeful. I can help," she said. "I've learned a lot. I want to help." Tom smiled, appreciating her determination and willingness. "Good. You've come a long way. Together we can make it through whatever comes next." The night grew deeper, and sleep came easily. For the first time in weeks, both felt a sense of peace and security. They had survived the harshest parts of winter, strengthened by their shared effort and growing friendship. The cabin, once just a shelter, had become a place of trust, learning, and hope. In the coming days, they continued to work together, preparing for the thaw. They repaired fences, stocked supplies, and began planning for planting and tending to the land as the snow melted. Each task, no matter how small, reinforced their partnership and trust. Akla's confidence grew daily, and Tom admired her resilience and courage. Spring arrived slowly, bringing with it melting snow, flowing streams, and the first signs of green in the landscape. The world seemed brighter and more alive, and both Tom and Akla felt the promise of new beginnings. They worked side by side, tending to the animals, preparing the land, and enjoying the warmth of the sun on their faces. The bond formed during the harsh winter had grown into a steady companionship, grounded in respect, shared experience, and quiet trust. As the days grew longer and the snow receded, Akla realized that she had found more than survival. She had found a sense of belonging and hope for the future. Tom, too, discovered that even after years of solitude, life could offer connection, growth, and the fulfillment of shared purpose. Together, they had faced the wilderness, endured its dangers and emerged stronger, ready to meet whatever challenges the future held. By the end of the season, the cabin stood secure, the animals healthy, and both felt prepared for the months ahead. The land had been harsh, but it had also taught them lessons about resilience, trust, and the quiet power of human kindness. They knew that the future would bring new challenges, but they also knew that together they could face anything. In the warmth of the cabin, as the sun set over the plains, Akela and Tom sat quietly, reflecting on the journey they had shared. From the first moment she stumbled into his life, shivering and lost, to the days of storms, survival, and shared labor, they had grown stronger together. What had begun as an act of simple kindness had evolved into a partnership rooted in respect, understanding, and the enduring human spirit. Outside, the plains were no longer entirely white and frozen. The signs of life returning, the flowing streams, and the gentle rustle of trees in the wind were reminders that even after the harshest winter, hope and renewal were possible. Inside, the fire burned steadily, and the cabin felt like a home, a place of warmth, safety, and the promise of new beginnings. And so, as night fell and the world outside rested under a sky full of stars, Akela and Tom embraced the quiet satisfaction of survival, growth, and companionship. The journey had been difficult, filled with danger and uncertainty, but it had also brought connection, understanding, and the knowledge that kindness and trust could endure even in the coldest and most unforgiving places. In the end, they had discovered something more valuable than mere survival: the strength of human spirit, the importance of compassion, and the enduring power of hope. Together, they faced the future with courage, ready to meet whatever the world might bring, confident in the bond they had formed through adversity, and filled with the quiet joy of life reclaimed in a harsh but beautiful land.